The hospital bracelet was pink, faded from years of being tucked away in my mother's jewelry box. I remember discovering it when I was 7, nestled between her pearl earrings and the silver locket that had belonged to my grandmother. The tiny plastic band had my name printed in careful block letters. Emma Claire Morrison, female, Dobb, 03151985. "What's this, Mama?" I had asked, holding up the delicate piece of plastic that seemed impossibly small. Mom's face had softened as she took it from my hands, her fingers tracing the worn edges. "That's your hospital bracelet, sweetheart, from when you were born. Every baby gets one so the nurses know who belongs to which family." I thought it was magical then. This tiny band that had been my first piece of identity in the world. I never could have imagined that 28 years later, that same bracelet would be the key to unraveling everything I thought I knew about my family. Growing up in Millbrook, Connecticut, our family was the picture of suburban perfection. Dad worked in finance in Manhattan, taking the 7:15 train every morning in his pressed suits and polished shoes. Mom stayed home with my sister Sarah and me, volunteering at the school library and organizing bake sales for the PTA. Our colonial house sat on a tree-lined street where neighbors still borrowed cups of sugar and children played kickball until the streetlights came on. Sarah was 18 months older than me, and from the outside, we were the ideal sister duo. She had inherited Mom's delicate features and strawberry blonde hair, while I got Dad's darker coloring and athletic build. We wore matching Christmas dresses for family photos and shared a bedroom with twin beds covered in identical pink quilts that Grandma Morrison had sewn for us. But beneath the surface of our picture-perfect life, something had always felt slightly off-kilter, like a photograph hung just a degree crooked on the wall. It was nothing I could put my finger on as a child, just a nagging sense that I was somehow different, somehow less than my beautiful, graceful sister. Sarah excelled at everything that came naturally to girls in our social circle. She took ballet lessons at Miss Patricia's Academy of Dance, her posture always perfect, her movements fluid and ethereal. She played piano with delicate fingers that seemed born to dance across ivory keys. At school, she was popular without trying, surrounded by friends who hung on her every word. I, on the other hand, was built for different things. I was taller, stronger, more comfortable on a soccer field than in a recital hall. While Sarah wore dresses and Mary Jane shoes, I preferred jeans and sneakers. While she spent hours styling her hair and painting her nails, I couldn't sit still long enough for such activities. Mom tried to encourage more ladylike pursuits, enrolling me in the same ballet classes as Sarah, but I was clumsy in tights and a tutu, my long limbs awkward where Sarah's were graceful. "Emma just marches to the beat of her own drum," Mom would say, when other mothers commented on the differences between us. But I caught the worried looks she exchanged with Dad when she thought we weren't watching, the way conversations stopped when I entered the room. It was during my sophomore year of high school that I first began to seriously question my place in the family. We were studying genetics in biology class, learning about dominant and recessive traits, when Mrs. Henderson had us chart our family characteristics. "Brown eyes are dominant over blue," she explained, drawing Punnett squares on the whiteboard. "So if both parents have brown eyes, their children will most likely have brown eyes too, unless both parents carry the recessive blue gene." I stared down at my worksheet, pencil hovering over the paper. Both my parents had brown eyes. Sarah had brown eyes, but mine were distinctly hazel, with flecks of green that became more prominent in certain light. I looked around the classroom, watching my classmates fill in their charts with obvious family resemblances. Kids who looked like smaller versions of their parents, who shared the same nose or smile or dimple. That night at dinner, I studied my family with new eyes. Dad's square jaw and broad shoulders were nowhere to be found in my narrower frame. Mom's petite stature and delicate bone structure seemed to have skipped me entirely, going straight to Sarah instead. Even our mannerisms were different. Sarah had Mom's way of tilting her head when she listened, while I gestured with my hands like no one in our family that I could identify. "Did I get anything from you guys?" I asked suddenly, interrupting Sarah's story about her lead role in the school play. The question hung in the air like smoke. Dad cleared his throat and took a long sip of water. Mom's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Mom asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I mean, Sarah looks just like you, and she has your personality too. But I don't really look like either of you, and I don't act like you either. Sometimes I feel like—" I trailed off, not sure how to voice the feeling that had been growing stronger each year. "You look like Aunt Catherine," Sarah said quickly, referring to Dad's sister who lived in California. "Same dark hair and green eyes." I wanted to believe that explanation, but Aunt Catherine's annual Christmas visits had never revealed the resemblance Sarah claimed to see. If anything, I looked even less like her than I did my parents. "Genetics are funny," Dad said, reaching over to ruffle my hair. "Sometimes traits skip generations or combine in unexpected ways. You're our daughter, Emma. That's all that matters." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and over the next few years, it grew into something I couldn't ignore. As we moved through high school, the differences between Sarah and me became even more pronounced. She was homecoming queen her senior year, dating the captain of the lacrosse team, accepted to Princeton with plans to study art history. I lettered in 3 sports, but struggled to maintain a B average, eventually settling on State University with an athletic scholarship for soccer. The way our parents talked about our futures revealed everything I needed to know about where I stood in the family hierarchy. Sarah's college acceptance was celebrated with a dinner at the country club, champagne toasts, and calls to extended family members who squealed with delight at the news. My scholarship offer was met with proud smiles and congratulations, but none of the fanfare that had surrounded Sarah's achievements. "We're so proud of both our girls," Mom would say when friends asked about us, but there was always something in her tone that suggested one of us was more worthy of pride than the other. It was during Sarah's graduation party that I overheard a conversation that crystallized years of suspicion into something sharper and more painful. I had gone inside to get more ice for the drinks when I heard Mom talking to her sister Nancy on the back porch. "She's just so different from the rest of us," Mom was saying, her voice carrying that worried tone I'd learned to recognize. "Sometimes I look at her and wonder." "Wonder what?" Nancy prompted. There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of ice clinking in glasses and the distant laughter from the party. "Nothing," Mom said finally. "I'm being silly. She's not like Sarah, that's all. Sometimes I worry we failed her somehow." I stood frozen by the kitchen window, the bag of ice growing heavy in my hands. The conversation moved on to other topics, but those words echoed in my mind long after the last party guest had gone home. Sometimes I look at her and wonder what? The question haunted me through the summer before I left for college, through late-night conversations with roommates who casually mentioned how much they looked like their mothers or shared their father's laugh. It followed me through 4 years of trying to forge my own identity, separate from a family that I was increasingly convinced I didn't truly belong to. College was a revelation. Away from the constant comparisons to Sarah, I discovered who I was when I wasn't trying to fit into a predetermined mold. I thrived on the soccer field, making varsity my freshman year and eventually becoming team captain. I found my academic stride in psychology and social work, drawn to helping people who, like me, felt like they didn't quite fit in their assigned places. I met David during my junior year, a kind, steady engineering student who made me laugh and never seemed to notice that I wasn't the feminine ideal Sarah embodied so effortlessly. We dated through college and into our careers, building a relationship based on genuine compatibility rather than social expectations. Meanwhile, Sarah glided through Princeton and into a prestigious internship at Sotheby's auction house. She was featured in the local newspaper as one of Millbrook's rising stars, photographed in designer clothes against the backdrop of million-dollar artwork. She married her college boyfriend James in a lavish ceremony at the country club where Mom had dreamed of hosting her daughter's wedding since we were children. I loved David, but our modest wedding at a local vineyard felt like a pale imitation of Sarah's fairy tale celebration. The differences in our parents' enthusiasm were impossible to ignore. Mom spent months planning every detail of Sarah's wedding, but seemed content to let me handle my own arrangements with minimal input. "It's your day, sweetheart," she said when I asked for her opinion on flowers. "I'm sure whatever you choose will be lovely." It was the same phrase she'd used when I couldn't decide between soccer cleats as a child, when I asked for help with college applications, when I announced my engagement. Supportive but distant, like she was watching my life from the outside rather than being invested in its outcome. David and I had been trying to have a baby for almost 2 years when Dr. Martinez suggested genetic testing. We'd been through multiple rounds of fertility treatments, and she wanted to rule out any hereditary factors that might be affecting our ability to conceive. "It's just a precaution," she assured us as she drew blood for the comprehensive panel. "Sometimes there are genetic variants that can impact fertility that we wouldn't know about otherwise." The testing required detailed family medical histories from both sides. I called Mom to ask about any reproductive issues or genetic conditions that might run in our family, expecting the usual, "No, nothing like that" response that had greeted most of my medical questions over the years. Instead, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Genetic testing?" Mom repeated, her voice strange and tight. "Just routine stuff," I explained. "The doctor wants to make sure there's nothing hereditary that could be affecting our fertility." Another pause. "I don't think that's necessary, Emma. These doctors always want to run more tests than they need to. It's just a way to make money." I was surprised by her resistance. Mom had always been supportive of medical care, the type to insist we see doctors for every minor ailment when we were children. "It's covered by insurance," I said, "and Dr. Martinez thinks it could really help us figure out what's going on." "Well," Mom said finally, "there's nothing in our family history that would be relevant. Both sides are perfectly healthy." But when I asked for specifics, ages of grandparents when they died, any history of miscarriages or fertility issues, Mom became evasive, claiming she couldn't remember details or didn't think they were important. It was David who suggested expanding the testing to include paternity confirmation, almost as an afterthought. "Since we're already doing genetic analysis," he reasoned, "it might be interesting to see the breakdown of your ethnic heritage. Some of these companies can give you really detailed information about your ancestry." I agreed without much thought. I was curious about the family history Mom seemed reluctant to discuss, and I thought it might be interesting to learn more about my genetic background. The results took 6 weeks to process. When Dr. Martinez called to schedule a follow-up appointment, her voice was carefully professional, but I caught an undertone that made my stomach tighten with anxiety. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Did you find something that would explain the fertility issues?" "Let's discuss everything when you come in," she said. "Can you and David make it in tomorrow afternoon?" David squeezed my hand as we sat in Dr. Martinez's office the next day, watching her review the thick file of test results. She had the same expression I'd seen on teachers' faces when they needed to deliver bad news about grades or behavior, compassionate but serious. "The good news is that there don't appear to be any genetic factors that would significantly impact your fertility," she began. "The tests show you're both healthy candidates for conception." I felt a wave of relief, followed immediately by confusion. If there was good news, why did she look so concerned? "However," Dr. Martinez continued, "there was something unexpected in your results, Emma. The paternity analysis shows some inconsistencies that you should be aware of." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Dr. Martinez pulled out a detailed chart covered in numbers and genetic markers that meant nothing to me. "Based on the genetic profile we have for your parents, there's less than a 0.01 probability that both of them are your biological parents." The words hit me like a physical blow. David's hand tightened on mine, but I couldn't feel it through the numbness spreading through my body. "What does that mean exactly?" David asked when I couldn't find my voice. "It means that either Emma's mother or father is not her biological parent. Given the specific markers we're seeing, it's most likely that her father is not her biological father." I stared at the chart, at the neat columns of numbers that had just shattered everything I thought I knew about my identity. 28 years of feeling like I didn't quite fit suddenly made horrible, perfect sense. "There must be a mistake," I whispered. "These tests aren't always accurate, right?" Dr. Martinez's expression was sympathetic, but firm. The technology is extremely reliable. We ran the test twice to be certain. I'm sorry, Emma. I know this must be shocking news. I drove around for 2 hours after leaving the doctor's office, David's concerned calls going straight to voicemail. I needed time to process the information, to figure out how to confront my parents with what I'd learned. The evidence was undeniable, but the implications were staggering. If Dad wasn't my biological father, that meant Mom had had an affair. It meant I was the product of a relationship she'd hidden from everyone, including me, for nearly 3 decades. It meant every awkward family gathering, every moment I'd felt like an outsider looking in, had been rooted in a fundamental lie about who I was. When I finally went home, David was waiting with a cup of tea and the kind of patient silence that made me fall in love with him in the first place. "What are you thinking?" he asked, after I'd told him about my afternoon of driving aimlessly through neighborhoods where I'd once felt at home. "I keep remembering things," I said, "little moments that make sense now. The way Mom gets nervous when I ask about family history. The way Dad sometimes looks at me like he's trying to solve a puzzle. The way I never felt like I belonged." David reached for my hand. "What do you want to do?" "I need to talk to them. I need to know the truth." But first, I called Sarah. If there were family secrets this significant, maybe she knew something that could help me understand. We'd grown closer since college, our childhood competition mellowing into adult friendship. If anyone would be honest with me about what she might have observed growing up, it would be her. "Emma," Sarah's voice was bright with genuine pleasure. "How did the appointment go? Did the doctor figure out what's going on with the fertility stuff?" I took a deep breath. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." The change in my tone must have alerted her that something was seriously wrong. "Okay," she said carefully. "What's going on? Did you ever notice anything strange about our family when we were kids? Anything that made you think I might be different?" There was a long pause. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was small and uncertain. "Why are you asking me this? The genetic testing showed that Dad isn't my biological father." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Sarah whispered, "Oh my God, Emma, I'm so sorry." "Did you know?" I asked, though something in her tone had already answered the question. "Not exactly," she said quickly. "I mean, I didn't know for sure, but..." "But what?" Another pause. There were things, conversations I overheard when I was older, looks that passed between Mom and Dad when they thought we weren't watching. And you're right, you always seemed different. Not just in looks, but in everything. Your interests, your personality, even the way you moved through the world. I felt a fresh wave of betrayal, not just at my parents, but at Sarah for keeping suspicions to herself all these years. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "What was I supposed to say?" Sarah's voice was defensive now. "I was just a kid, and I wasn't sure of anything. I thought maybe I was imagining things, or maybe it didn't matter because you were my sister regardless." "It matters to me," I said quietly. "It matters that I've spent my whole life feeling like an outsider in my own family." "Emma, I'm sorry. I don't know what I should have done, but you're still my sister. This doesn't change that." But it changed everything for me. It changed the context of every childhood memory, every moment of feeling less than, every comparison that had made me question my worth. Most importantly, it changed how I needed to approach the conversation with our parents. I waited until the weekend to drive up to Millbrook. Mom and Dad were expecting me for Sunday dinner, our usual monthly tradition that I'd maintained even after moving an hour away. Sarah had offered to come with me, but I needed to do this alone. The house looked exactly the same as it had throughout my childhood, perfectly maintained colonial with seasonal decorations that Mom changed with military precision. But walking up the front steps, I felt like a stranger approaching a house I'd never lived in. Mom greeted me with her usual hug and immediate concern about whether I was eating enough, whether David was treating me well, whether I needed anything from home. Dad was in his study, reading the Sunday paper with the same concentration he'd brought to weekend mornings for as long as I could remember. "How did the doctor's appointment go?" Mom asked as we prepared dinner together, falling into the familiar rhythm of our shared kitchen tasks. I continued chopping vegetables, not trusting myself to look at her yet. It was interesting. We learned some things we weren't expecting. Oh? Nothing serious, I hope? The casual tone of her question, as if we were discussing the weather or weekend plans, made my anger flare. Here was my mother, acting out our usual script, while sitting on a secret that had shaped my entire life. Actually, it was pretty serious, I said, setting down the knife and turning to face her. The genetic testing showed that Dad isn't my biological father. The ceramic bowl Mom had been holding slipped from her hands, shattering against the kitchen floor in an explosion of white porcelain. The sound brought Dad running from his study, taking in the scene with quick, intelligent eyes that immediately understood we weren't talking about an accidental dish disaster. "Emma," Mom whispered, her face gone white. "I can explain." "Can you?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the trembling in my hands. "Because I've been trying to explain to myself for 28 years why I never felt like I belonged in this family, and now I finally have an answer." Dad moved carefully around the broken ceramic to reach Mom's side, his hand settling protectively on her shoulder. The gesture was automatic, practiced, and it told me everything I needed to know about whether he'd been aware of the situation. "Sit down," Dad said quietly. "Both of you. We'll clean this up later." We moved to the living room, the same space where we'd opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays, and posed for countless family photos. I sat in the chair I'd claimed as my own during high school, while Mom and Dad took their usual places on the sofa, united against whatever was coming. "How long have you known?" I asked Dad directly. He ran his hands through his graying hair, a gesture I recognized from my own moments of stress. "Since you were about 2 years old." The answer hit me like a punch to the chest, not since my birth, but since I was 2. Which meant there had been a period when he'd believed I was his daughter, when he'd presumably loved me as his own child, before learning the truth. What happened when I was 2? Mom and Dad exchanged one of those long, silent conversations that married couples develop over decades together. Finally, Mom spoke. "You got pneumonia that winter. You were so sick we thought we might lose you. The doctor ordered blood work to monitor your condition, and the results showed." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Showed that your blood type was incompatible with ours," Dad continued. "Both your mother and I are type A. You're type O. It's genetically impossible for 2 type A parents to have a type O child." I stared at them, trying to process not just the information but the implications of how long they'd carried this secret. "You've known for 26 years and never said anything?" "What were we supposed to say?" Mom asked, tears streaming down her face. "You were our daughter. You are our daughter. The biology doesn't change that." "It changes everything." I stood up, pacing to the window that looked out on the backyard where Sarah and I had played as children. "It changes why I never felt like I fit in, why I was always the odd one out, why you guys always seemed more invested in Sarah's life than mine." "That's not true," Dad said firmly. "We love you both equally." "Do you?" I turned back to face them. "Because my whole life, I've felt like I was a disappointment compared to Sarah. She was the daughter you were proud of, the one who fit your expectations, while I was just the weird kid who played sports and couldn't sit still in church." "Emma, please." Mom reached toward me, but I stepped back. "I need to know who my biological father is." The silence that followed was loaded with implications I was only beginning to understand. Mom's tears came harder now, and Dad's jaw tightened in a way I'd seen when he was preparing to deliver news no one wanted to hear. "Mom?" I prompted when neither of them spoke. "His name was Michael Chen," Mom said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was a colleague of mine when I was working part-time at the architectural firm downtown. The name meant nothing to me, but it explained the features I'd never been able to trace to anyone in our family. My darker coloring, my height, the shape of my eyes that had always seemed slightly different from the rest of the family's. Was it... I couldn't bring myself to ask if it had been an affair or something worse. It was a brief relationship, Mom said quickly. Your father and I were going through a difficult time. We'd been trying to have another baby after Sarah, and nothing was happening. I was lonely and confused, and Michael was kind to me when I felt invisible at home. I looked at Dad, trying to read his expression. Did you know while it was happening? No, he said. I found out when you did during that blood test. Your mother told me everything then. And you decided to stay together? We decided we loved each other and we loved you, Dad said. The circumstances of your conception didn't change the fact that you were our daughter from the moment you were born. The words should have been comforting, but they felt hollow against the backdrop of a lifetime of feeling like an outsider. If you loved me the same as Sarah, why did it always feel like you were just tolerating me? This time, it was Mom who answered. Because I was terrified, she said. Every day, I was terrified that somehow you'd find out, or that someone else would figure it out. I was so scared of losing everything, your father, our family, our life, that I think I pulled back from you without realizing it. I thought if I kept some distance, it would be easier if the truth ever came out, and you decided you wanted nothing to do with us. The explanation was heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. My mother's fear had created the very distance she'd been trying to protect against, making me feel unwanted in the process. What about Michael? I asked. Does he know about me? Mom shook her head. I never told him I was pregnant. He moved to California not long after our relationship ended. I don't know if he's still alive or where he is. So I have a biological father somewhere who doesn't even know I exist? Emma, Dad said, his voice gentle but firm. I'm your father. I've been your father since the day you were born. Biology doesn't change 28 years of loving you, supporting you, being proud of everything you've accomplished. I wanted to believe him, but the words felt complicated by everything I'd learned. How do you reconcile a lifetime of feeling like you don't belong with the revelation that your sense of not belonging was rooted in biological reality? How do you separate genuine love from duty or guilt or fear? I need time to process this, I said finally. I can't just pretend everything is the same now that I know the truth. Of course, Mom said. Take all the time you need, but please don't shut us out completely. You're still our daughter, no matter what. I looked around the living room one more time at the family photos that now felt like documentation of a lie, at the parents who'd raised me but weren't who I thought they were, at the home where I'd never quite felt at home. I need to go, I said, and walked out without looking back. 3 days later, Sarah showed up at my apartment with takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her wedding ring in a way that reminded me of Mom's anxious habits. How are you holding up? She asked as we sat on my couch, containers of pad thai growing cold between us. I don't know, I admitted. Everything feels different now. Like my whole life has been recontextualized, and I don't know how to make sense of it. Sarah nodded, pouring wine for both of us. I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, and there's something else I need to tell you. My stomach dropped. What now? It's about the hospital bracelets. I stared at her, not understanding. What about them? Sarah took a large gulp of wine before answering. Do you remember when we were kids, maybe 5 and 6, and Mom took us to visit Mrs. Patterson, who'd just had her baby? I had a vague memory of visiting one of Mom's friends in the hospital, but I couldn't recall specifics. Sort of. Why? We were in the nursery looking at all the babies through the window. You were asking about the bracelets they wore, how the nurses knew which babies belonged to which families. Mrs. Patterson was explaining how important they were, how they made sure no babies ever got switched. A chill ran down my spine. Sarah, what are you trying to tell me? You got really upset about something. You started crying and saying that you wanted to make sure you belonged to the right family. Mrs. Patterson thought it was cute, but it made me think about something that had happened when we were babies. What happened? Sarah set down her wine glass and looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. I switched our hospital bracelets. The words didn't register immediately. I heard them, but they seemed to exist in some alternate reality where my sister was confessing to something impossible. What do you mean, you switched them? When we were babies, maybe a few days old, I somehow got into the nursery. I don't remember exactly how. I was barely walking, but I remember pulling the bracelets off our ankles and putting mine on you and yours on me. The room spun around me. That's not possible. You were 18 months old. Babies that age can't do something that deliberate. I know it sounds crazy, but I have this clear memory of doing it. And I think Mom saw me, but by the time she realized what had happened, we'd already been discharged from the hospital. I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Sarah, do you understand what you're saying? You're saying that you're not Mom and Dad's biological daughter. You're saying that I am. I think so, yes. But that doesn't make sense with the genetic testing. The tests showed that Dad isn't my biological father. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. What if the tests were wrong about who they were testing? The implication hit me like a freight train. If Sarah had switched our bracelets as babies, and if somehow that switch had never been corrected, then the blood sample I'd given for genetic testing might not have been mine at all. But that was impossible. I'd been sitting right there when the nurse drew my blood. Sarah, I was at the doctor's office when they took my blood. There's no way they tested your DNA instead of mine. No, but what if the family history information was wrong? What if Mom gave them information about my biological family instead of yours, not knowing that we'd been switched? I sank back onto the couch, my mind racing through the implications. But Mom would know if we'd been switched. She's our mother. Surely she'd know which baby was which. Would she? Sarah asked quietly. We were newborns. We probably looked pretty similar, and if she'd been dealing with postpartum exhaustion, or if the switch happened when she wasn't around. This is insane, I said, but even as I spoke, pieces were starting to fall into place. But it would explain why you always fit so perfectly into the family, while I felt like an outsider. Emma, there's more. I looked at my sister, or the woman I'd thought was my sister, and realized I wasn't sure I could handle any more revelations. The reason I remember switching the bracelet so clearly is because Mom caught me doing it. She was horrified, but the nurse assured her that it didn't matter because we were both her babies. But later, when you were sick with pneumonia, and they did the blood work. She realized the switch had never been corrected, I finished. And by then, we'd been living as each other for 2 years. You were Emma and I was Sarah, and how do you undo something like that? I felt like I was drowning in information that rewrote not just my identity, but my entire family history. So you're saying that my whole life, I've been living as the wrong person? That I'm actually Sarah and you're actually Emma? I think so. And I think Mom and Dad have known since you were 2, but they couldn't figure out how to fix it without destroying everything. The room was silent except for the sound of my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Everything I'd learned in the past week was reorganizing itself into a new pattern that was somehow both impossible and perfectly logical. We need another DNA test, I said finally. Are you sure you want to know for certain? I looked at Sarah, who might actually be Emma, and realized that despite everything that had been revealed, she was still the person who'd grown up beside me, who'd shared a bedroom and Christmas mornings and family vacations. Biology might determine our names and our place in the family tree, but it couldn't change the relationship we'd built over nearly 3 decades. I need to know who I really am, I said. Don't you? 2 weeks later, we sat in a different doctor's office, this time with a genetic counselor who specialized in family mysteries. Sarah had insisted on coming with me, and we'd both agreed to comprehensive DNA analysis that would not only determine paternity, but also compare our genetic profiles to each other. This is highly unusual, Doctor. Williams admitted as she reviewed our case. But certainly not impossible. Hospital mix-ups, while rare, do occur, and if there was indeed a bracelet switch in infancy, it could explain the discrepancies you've been experiencing. The testing took another 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which Sarah and I talked more honestly than we ever had in our lives, examining memories through the lens of our potential switched identities. She admitted that she'd always felt pressure to be perfect, as if she were performing the role of the ideal daughter rather than naturally embodying it. I confessed that I'd always felt like I was disappointing everyone simply by being myself. We didn't tell our parents about Sarah's confession until we had the results. The weight of the secret felt too enormous to share without certainty, and I wasn't sure I could handle another emotional confrontation if the tests proved our suspicions wrong. When Dr. Williams called to schedule our results appointment, her tone was carefully professional, giving nothing away. "I'd like to meet with both of you together, if that's possible," she said. "And you may want to consider having your parents present as well." Sarah and I looked at each other across my kitchen table, where we'd been waiting for the call. "That good or bad?" I asked. "With family genetic cases, I always recommend having all involved parties present for the discussion," Dr. Williams replied diplomatically. So the four of us sat in Dr. Williams' office on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the autumn light filtering through windows that looked out on trees just beginning to turn. Mom and Dad sat together on one side of the room, while Sarah and I took chairs across from them. The distance felt symbolic of the chasm that had opened in our family since my initial test results. Dr. Williams spread several charts across her desk, colorful genetic maps that held the answers to questions I'd been carrying my entire life. "The results are quite remarkable," she began, "and they confirm what Emma and Sarah suspected. Based on the genetic analysis, Sarah Morrison is the biological daughter of Richard and Margaret Morrison. Emma Morrison is not biologically related to either parent." I felt a strange sense of vindication mixed with loss. I'd been right about not belonging, but being right meant accepting that everything I'd believed about my identity was false. "However," Dr. Williams continued, "there's more to the story. The additional testing we ran reveals that Emma and Sarah are indeed biological sisters." The room went completely silent. I stared at the genetic counselor, not sure I'd heard correctly. "What do you mean?" Mom asked, her voice barely audible. Dr. Williams pointed to the genetic markers on her charts. "Emma and Sarah share approximately 50 of their DNA, which indicates they are full biological sisters. Same mother, same father." The implications crashed over me like a tidal wave. If Sarah and I were biological sisters, and if she was the biological daughter of my parents, then that meant— "I don't understand," Dad said slowly. "If Emma isn't our biological daughter, but she and Sarah are sisters, it means that Margaret Morrison is not Sarah's biological mother," Dr. Williams said gently. "The genetic evidence shows that Emma and Sarah are sisters who were both born to the same biological parents, neither of whom appear to be Richard or Margaret Morrison." Mom made a sound like she'd been struck, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. Dad reached for her hand, but she pulled away, staring at the genetic charts as if they might rearrange themselves into a different truth. "That's impossible," Mom whispered. "I gave birth to Sarah. I remember everything about her birth. The labor, holding her for the first time, nursing her." "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Williams said compassionately, "hospital mix-ups, while extremely rare, do occasionally happen. Based on what Emma and Sarah have told me about the bracelet incident, it's possible that there was a switch early in the infant's hospital stay that was never corrected." I looked at Sarah, seeing my own shock reflected in her face. "So, you're both biological sisters who were separated at birth and raised by different families," Dr. Williams confirmed. "Sarah was raised by the Morrisons, while Emma was raised by—" She gestured to Mom and Dad, the people who had loved and raised me but who were now revealed to be strangers connected to me only by circumstance and choice. "Where are our real parents?" Sarah asked, her voice small and lost. Dr. Williams consulted another chart. "Based on the genetic markers, I can tell you that your biological parents would both be of mixed European and East Asian heritage. Beyond that, we'd need additional testing or family records to determine more specific information." The room fell into stunned silence. Everything we'd thought we knew about our family, our identities, our place in the world, had been turned upside down in the span of a single conversation. "Michael Chen," I said suddenly, remembering Mom's confession from the previous week. Everyone turned to look at me. What about Michael Chen? Dad asked. Mom said that's who she thought was my biological father, mixed heritage European and Asian. What if he wasn't my father at all? What if he was Sarah's biological father, and somehow there was a baby switch at the hospital that separated us from our real family? Mom's face had gone completely white. No, she said, shaking her head. No, that's not possible. I carried Sarah for 9 months. I felt her move inside me. I went through labor. Mrs. Morrison, Dr. Williams interjected gently, is it possible that you gave birth to a different baby? One who went home with another family while you took home the baby you knew as Sarah? The question hung in the air like a live wire. I watched my mother, the woman who had raised me, who had worried over my scraped knees and celebrated my achievements and loved me in the only way she knew how, grapple with the possibility that even her most fundamental memories might be built on a mistake. I need to call the hospital, Mom said suddenly, standing up with the jerky movements of someone in shock. I need to find out what happened. There have to be records. Mom, Sarah said, rising to follow her, maybe we should— No! Mom's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. I need to know. I need to understand how this happened. She left the office with Dad following close behind, leaving Sarah and me alone with Dr. Williams and the genetic charts that had just redefined our entire existence. What happens now? I asked. That depends on what you want to happen, Dr. Williams replied. Some families in similar situations choose to search for the biological parents or the switched siblings. Others decide that the families they've known are the families that matter, regardless of genetics. There's no right or wrong choice. I looked at Sarah, this person who had been my sister, my rival, my closest family connection, and who was now revealed to be something even deeper, my actual sister, separated from me by a twist of fate that had shaped both our lives in ways we were only beginning to understand. We need to find them, Sarah said quietly. We need to find our biological parents and the family that raised our real sibling. Our real sibling. The phrase hit me like a punch to the chest. Somewhere out there was another person who had grown up thinking they were Sarah Morrison, just as I had grown up thinking I was Emma Morrison, someone who might have spent their life feeling like they didn't quite fit in their family, never knowing why. The investigation that followed was both heartbreaking and miraculous. Mom, despite her initial shock and denial, threw herself into uncovering the truth with the same thoroughness she'd once applied to planning school fundraisers and family vacations. She contacted the hospital where Sarah and I had been born, requesting records from 1983 and 1985. What we discovered was a story of human error that had cascaded through multiple lives for nearly 3 decades. The hospital had indeed experienced a period of staffing shortages and procedural irregularities in the mid-1980s. There had been at least 3 documented cases of patient mix-ups during that time, though none as complex as what had apparently happened to our families. The records showed that on March 15, 1985, my supposed birth date, 2 babies had been born within hours of each other to families with similar last names, Morrison and Morimoto. In the chaos of a busy maternity ward, combined with the bracelet switch that Sarah remembered committing, it appeared that the babies had been sent home with the wrong families. Margaret Morimoto had given birth to a daughter she named Emma, but had gone home with the baby who should have been Sarah Morrison. Meanwhile, Margaret Morrison had given birth to a daughter she named Sarah, but had taken home the baby who should have been Emma Morimoto. The real Emma Morimoto had been raised as Sarah Morrison Me. The real Sarah Morrison had been raised as Emma Morimoto, the person we now knew as Sarah. But there was still a missing piece to the puzzle. Where was the baby who had gone home with the Morimotos? Where was the real Emma Morimoto, the biological sister Sarah and I had never known existed? The hospital records led us to the Morimoto family, who had lived in a different part of Connecticut. Michael Morimoto had been an engineer, his wife Jennifer a teacher. They had tried for years to have children before finally conceiving through fertility treatments in 1983 and 1985. When we called the number listed in the hospital records, an elderly man answered with a voice that immediately reminded me of my own father, not Dad, but the father whose genes I carried. Mr. Morimoto? I said, my hands shaking as I held the phone. This is going to sound very strange, but I believe I might be your daughter. The conversation that followed was surreal. Michael Morimoto, my biological father, had spent 28 years believing he was raising his biological daughter, Emma, just as Richard Morrison had spent the same years believing Sarah was his biological daughter. Neither family had ever suspected a switch. Emma's always been different from Jennifer and me, Michael admitted during our first phone conversation. Blonde hair, blue eyes, different interests, and personality. But we just assumed she took after Jennifer's side of the family. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. The baby who had gone home with the Morimotos was the biological daughter of Richard and Margaret Morrison, the child they had unknowingly given up in exchange for me. Her name was Emma Morimoto, but genetically she was the Morrison daughter who should have grown up as Sarah's sister. She was 26 years old, worked as a graphic designer in Hartford, and according to her father, had always felt somewhat disconnected from her family despite their love and support. She's always been searching for something, Michael said, always asking questions about family history, always feeling like she didn't quite belong. Maybe now we'll understand why. We arranged to meet on neutral ground, a park halfway between our respective cities, on a Saturday afternoon in November, when the autumn leaves created a carpet of gold and red beneath our feet. Michael and Jennifer Morimoto arrived first, a couple in their early 60s who looked nervous and hopeful in equal measure. Dad and Mom came next, their faces showing the strain of the past month's revelations. Then Sarah and I arrived together, and finally, a young woman with familiar blonde hair and blue eyes walked across the parking lot toward our small group. Emma Morimoto. The biological Sarah Morrison was beautiful in the delicate, ethereal way that Sarah had always embodied, but that had never felt natural to me. She moved with the same grace, had the same way of tilting her head when she was uncertain, the same nervous laugh that I recognized from family gatherings. Looking at her felt like looking at the sister I should have grown up with, the daughter my parents should have raised. She was everything Sarah had been in our family, the perfect fit for the Morrison aesthetic and expectations. But when she looked at me, her eyes, Dad's brown eyes, the ones Sarah had inherited, widened with recognition. "You look like my father," she said softly, gesturing to Michael Morimoto. "And you look like mine," I replied, nodding toward Dad. Sarah stood between us, the sister who belonged to neither family by blood but who had been shaped by experiences with both, the bridge between two worlds that should never have been separated. "This is so surreal," Emma Morimoto said, her voice carrying traces of the same inflection patterns I'd grown up hearing from Mom. "I've spent my whole life feeling like I didn't match my family, and now we know why," I finished. We spent the afternoon in that park, 3 young women who had been sisters, strangers, and something in between, trying to make sense of the twisted path that had brought us together. Our parents sat on benches nearby, their own conversations subdued and careful as they navigated relationships that had been redefined by biology and circumstance. Emma Morimoto, who insisted we call her M to avoid confusion, shared stories from her childhood that mirrored my own sense of displacement. She had felt too delicate for the robust, outdoorsy family that had raised her, too interested in traditional feminine pursuits for parents who valued academic and athletic achievement above social graces. "I always wanted to take ballet," she said, laughing softly. "But my parents thought I should focus on more practical skills. They enrolled me in computer programming camps and engineering clubs, trying to follow in my dad's footsteps." "I was forced into ballet," Sarah replied. "I loved it, but I sometimes wondered what it would have been like to try soccer or track instead." "I played soccer for 12 years, I added. "Never wanted to do anything else." The conversation was both healing and heartbreaking. We were discovering the people we might have been if we'd grown up in our correct families, while also recognizing how the mix-up had shaped us into who we had become. The months that followed were complicated in ways none of us could have anticipated. Legal names were changed. I became Emma Chen Morrison, Sarah became Sarah Morimoto Morrison, and M became Emma Morrison. But names felt less important than the emotional work of rebuilding relationships and identities that had been fundamentally altered. Sarah and I remained close, our bond strengthened by shared experience, rather than weakened by the revelation of our true biological relationship. We had been sisters in every way that mattered, and learning we were also biological sisters felt like confirmation of something we'd always known on a deeper level. Em was harder to connect with initially. She was shy and uncertain, having grown up as an only child, with parents who had struggled to understand her interests and personality. But gradually, as we spent time together, I began to recognize aspects of the Morrison family dynamic in her mannerisms and responses. The relationship between our parents was the most complex to navigate. Dad and Mom had to rebuild their understanding of their family while also developing new relationships with the biological children they'd never known. Michael and Jennifer Morimoto faced the revelation that their beloved daughter wasn't biologically theirs, while also trying to connect with the daughters who were. "It doesn't matter," Dad said one evening when we were having dinner together, all 7 of us, trying to figure out how to be a family. "You're all our daughters now. Biology just tells us who contributed the DNA. Love and choice and shared experience, that's what makes a family." Mom was slower to accept the new reality. She struggled with the loss of the biological connection she'd believed she had with Sarah, while also grappling with the knowledge that she'd missed Em's entire childhood. But gradually, she began to build relationships based on who we all were rather than who we were supposed to be. The most surprising development was the connection between Em and the parents who had raised me. She fit so naturally into their world, interested in their stories, comfortable with their expectations, graceful in their social circles in a way I had never been. It was both painful and liberating to watch her slide into the space I had never been able to fill, while I found my own place in a more complex but more honest family structure. David and I were married the following spring, in a ceremony that would have been impossible to plan a year earlier. Sarah was my maid of honor, as she'd always been meant to be. Em was a bridesmaid, still shy but gradually becoming part of our extended family circle. Both sets of parents walked me down the aisle, Mom and Dad who had raised me, Michael and Jennifer who had given me life. The wedding photos showed a complex family tree that couldn't be explained by traditional relationships, but that reflected the reality of love that transcends biology. Sarah and Em stood on either side of me, sisters in different ways, but sisters nonetheless. Our parents, all 4 of them, smiled with the complicated joy of people who had learned that families can be built and rebuilt, that love is a choice that can accommodate any truth. 3 months later, I found out I was pregnant. The news brought a mixture of joy and anxiety that surprised me with its intensity. After everything we'd been through to understand genetics and family connections, I was suddenly faced with the prospect of creating a new family member whose place in our complex web of relationships would be determined by love rather than biology from the very beginning. "What will the baby call everyone?" Sarah asked during one of our weekly coffee dates. We were sitting in the same cafe where we'd met to discuss the initial DNA test results, but everything felt different now. The weight of secrets had been lifted, replaced by the lighter burden of figuring out how to navigate relationships that didn't fit traditional categories. "I guess we'll figure it out as we go," I said, my hand resting on my still flat stomach. Maybe that's what family really is, not following predetermined roles, but creating new ones that fit who we actually are. My daughter was born on a snowy February morning, with all 7 of her grandparents present at the hospital. Yes, 7, because by then, Sarah had married James, and his parents had also been absorbed into our unconventional extended family. Em had started dating a colleague from her graphic design firm, and his family was beginning to orbit our complex constellation as well. We named her Grace, for the grace we'd all learned to extend to each other in navigating our rewritten family story. Her hospital bracelet was pink, just like mine had been, but this time we paid careful attention to make sure it stayed exactly where it belonged. Grace looks like David, with his steady brown eyes and patient smile, but she has my stubborn streak and Sarah's laugh. When I look at her, I see the future of our family, a generation that will grow up knowing that love and choice matter more than biology, that families can be complicated and still be strong, that identity is something you create rather than something you inherit. Sarah and James had their first child 8 months later, a son who immediately became Grace's closest companion. Em is still single but talks about wanting children someday, and we've all promised that any babies she has will be surrounded by the same unconventional love that has sustained us through the most difficult revelations of our lives. Mom and Dad, because they will always be Mom and Dad to me, regardless of genetics, have embraced their roles as chosen grandparents with the same dedication they brought to being chosen parents. Michael and Jennifer have become unexpected sources of wisdom and support, offering perspectives on parenting that complement rather than compete with the lessons I learned growing up. The hospital bracelet from my birth is still in Mom's jewelry box, but now it sits next to Em's bracelet, from the same day 2 pieces of faded pink plastic that tell the story of how families can be broken apart and rebuilt, how love can survive even the most fundamental revelations about identity and belonging. Sometimes I think about the chain of small decisions that led to our family's current configuration. A overworked nurse who didn't double-check a bracelet placement, an 18-month-old child's impulse to switch jewelry, parents who chose love over biology when faced with impossible truths, a young woman's decision to pursue fertility testing that revealed more than anyone expected. Each choice seemed insignificant at the time, but together they created the family we've become, messy and complicated, but bound together by something stronger than shared DNA. I still keep my original hospital bracelet in my jewelry box now, next to Grace's and the ultrasound photos from my pregnancy. But I understand now that it's not a symbol of my identity or my place in the world. It's simply a reminder that families are made of choices, not just genetics, and that love is strong enough to survive even the most earth-shattering revelations about who we really are. The other day, Grace asked me why she has so many grandparents when her friends only have 4. I tried to explain about the hospital mix-up and the DNA tests and the complicated web of relationships that brought our family together. "So you mean I have extra grandparents because of a mistake?" she asked, her 4-year-old logic cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Not a mistake," I said, pulling her onto my lap. "A different kind of blessing. Sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones that don't follow the rules." She nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense, then ran off to play with her cousins, biological and chosen alike, while I watched from the kitchen window of the house David and I had bought just down the street from Sarah and James. Our children will grow up knowing that families can be rewritten, that love is a choice you make every day, and that the most important connections in life aren't always the ones you're born with. They'll understand that identity is something you create rather than something you inherit, and that belonging isn't about matching the people around you, it's about being loved for exactly who you are. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never taken that DNA test, if we'd all gone on living our switched lives without ever knowing the truth. Would I have continued feeling like an outsider in the Morrison family? Would Em have spent her whole life feeling disconnected from the Morimotos? Would Sarah have remained the perfect daughter, unaware that her biological family was scattered across different homes? But then I look at Grace playing with her abundance of cousins while surrounded by grandparents who chose to love her before she was even born, and I know that every painful revelation was worth it. The truth tore our family apart, but it also gave us the chance to rebuild it on a foundation of choice and honesty, rather than assumption and secrets. The hospital bracelet that started it all sits in my jewelry box as a reminder that sometimes the smallest objects can hold the biggest truths. But more importantly, it reminds me that family isn't about the name on a plastic bracelet or the genes in your DNA. It's about the people who choose to love you, who stay with you through revelations that shake the very foundation of your identity, who help you rebuild your sense of self when everything you thought you knew turns out to be wonderfully, terrifyingly wrong. We are the Morrison-Morimoto-Chen family now, a hyphenated impossibility that somehow makes perfect sense. We are sisters and daughters and mothers, connected by biology and choice and circumstance and love. We are proof that families can survive anything, even the discovery that everything you believed about them was built on a beautiful, decades-long mistake. And sometimes, late at night when Grace is sleeping and David is reading beside me, I take out that faded pink bracelet and remember the little girl who wore it home from the hospital 28 years ago. She thought it meant she belonged to one family, but it turned out to be her passport to something much larger and more complicated and more wonderful than she could have ever imagined. The bracelet was never really about belonging to the right family. It was about discovering that the right family is the one that chooses you, keeps you, and loves you through every twist and revelation life brings. It was about learning that home isn't a place you're born into. It's a place you build, one choice at a time, with the people who matter most.